Today we will explore the fascinating and millenary history of tarot cards, from their Oriental origins to their consolidation as one of the most emblematic cultural objects of the Western world. A journey that crosses continents, centuries, and civilizations, revealing how simple pieces of illustrated paper were transformed into symbols of power, art, and mystery. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There exists, somewhere between the remote past and the present, an invisible thread that connects the hands of a 13th century Egyptian artisan to the hands of an Italian nobleman of the Renaissance. This thread crosses deserts, seas, and mountains. It travels through forgotten trade routes and the corridors of sumptuous palaces, and along its length it carries something that at first glance may seem trivial: a deck of cards. But these cards are not trivial. They hold within them a story that few know in its entirety, a story of transformation, of cultural exchanges, of art, and of power. A story that begins much earlier than most people imagine, and that unfolds in surprising ways throughout the centuries. To understand this story, one must go back in time. Not to medieval Europe, as many suppose, but to a place even more distant, both in space and chronology. One must go back to Asia, where paper was invented, and from where it began its slow migration to the West, carrying with it a possibility that would forever change the way human beings entertained themselves, gambled, and later sought meaning in the unknown. Paper, an invention so fundamental to civilization, was born in ancient China, and with it were also born the first card games on record. These primitive games, known as money cards, used suits that represented coins and financial values, reflecting the commercial culture of Chinese society. Over the centuries, these cards traveled along the Silk Road, passing through Persia and the Arab world, transforming at every stop, adapting to each culture that welcomed them. It was in the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, between the 13th and 14th centuries, that playing cards gained a form that would become decisive for the entire subsequent history. The Mamluks, those warriors of Turkish and Circassian origin who had been enslaved and later rose to power, ruling Egypt and parts of the Levant, developed a sophisticated and elegant deck that reflected the values of their court. This deck, composed of 52 cards divided into 4 suits, is considered by most historians to be the direct ancestor of European decks. The 4 suits of the Mamluk deck were coins, swords, cups, and polo sticks. Each suit contained 10 numbered cards and 3 court cards, named Malik, which meant king, Naib Malik, or viceroy, and Thani Naib, the second viceroy. It is interesting to note that the very term used to designate playing cards in several European languages carries echoes of this Arabic origin. In Spanish, for example, cards are called naipes, a word that derives directly from the term naib used in Mamluk decks. One of the most significant discoveries for understanding this heritage happened in 1931, when the historian Leo Arieh Meyer found in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul an almost complete set of Mamluk playing cards. These cards, dating from the 15th century, were extraordinarily beautiful, decorated with intricate floral patterns, ornate Arabic calligraphy, and gilded details. Unlike the European decks that would come later, the Mamluk court cards did not feature human figures, following the Islamic tradition of avoiding the representation of living beings. In their place, there were calligraphic inscriptions indicating the value and position of each card, accompanied by verses that functioned as maxims of good luck. But the Topkapi set was not the only trace of the existence of these cards. Even older fragments dating from the 12th and 13th centuries were found in the Kir collection and the Benaki Museum, corresponding to the late Fatimid, Ayyubid, and early Mamluk periods. These fragments constitute the oldest known playing cards in the world, and their existence confirms that the tradition of card games in the Islamic world was deep and well established long before any European record. The passage of the cards from the Islamic world to Europe is a fascinating chapter of this story. Scholars believe this happened primarily through the trade routes that connected North Africa and the Middle East to Italian and Spanish ports. Venice, Genoa, and Barcelona were natural points of contact between Christian and Islamic civilizations, and it was through these channels that playing cards reached the European continent. The oldest record of playing cards in Europe dates back to 1367. Found in Bern, Switzerland, although this source is contested by some researchers, as the oldest available copy dates back to 1398 and may have been altered. What is generally accepted as the first Italian reference is a Florentine prohibition dated 1377. Whatever the exact date, one thing is certain. From their appearance, cards spread across Europe with impressive speed, as evidenced by the numerous records of prohibitions on card games that emerged in various cities in the following decades. Little is known about the appearance and number of these first European cards. The most significant information comes from a text written by Johannes de Rheinfelden in 1377 in the city of Freiburg, Germany. In this document, Rheinfelden describes, among other variations, a basic deck containing the still current 4 suits of 13 cards each, with the court cards generally being the king, the ober, and the unter, terms that meant something like superior and inferior marshals, although dames and queens were already known at that time. The Europeans, upon receiving the Mamluk cards, set about adapting them to their own cultural context. The suits were modified but maintained evident similarities to their Islamic predecessors. Coins remained as coins, swords continued to be swords, and cups remained as cups. Only the polo sticks, a sport unknown in Europe, were reinterpreted as staves, clubs, or scepters. The court cards, which in the Mamluk deck were represented only by calligraphic inscriptions, gained human figures reflecting the European tradition of pictorial representation. Kings, knights, and pages replaced the sultans and viceroys of the East. The first European decks used the suits of staves or clubs, coins, swords, and cups. These suits are still used today in traditional Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese decks, and also in modern divinatory tarot decks, which first appeared at the end of the 18th century. It is a remarkable continuity, a link that persists over more than 600 years. But the story that really interests us here is not just that of common playing cards. It is the story of something more complex, more mysterious, and more artistic, the emergence of tarot. And to tell this story, we need to transport ourselves to northern Italy at the beginning of the 15th century, a region that bustled with creativity, ambition, and power. Italy at that period was not a unified country, but a mosaic of city-states, duchies, and republics, each with its own identity, its own rulers, and its own political intrigues. Milan, Ferrara, Florence, Bologna, Venice. Each of these cities was a world unto itself, and its rulers competed with each other not only for military and economic power, but also for cultural prestige. It was the era of the Renaissance, a period of unprecedented intellectual and artistic effervescence, and the Italian courts were the radiating centers of this transformation. It was in this context that something new emerged. Sometime between the 1410s and 1440s, someone had the idea of adding a set of special cards to the common deck of 4 suits. These additional cards featured allegorical illustrations, figures representing universal concepts such as justice, fortitude, the wheel of fortune, death, judgment, and the world. These were the triumphi, the triumphs, which would later be called trunfos in Portuguese and trumps in English. The first concrete evidence of the existence of these cards with trumps comes from a written record in the court records of Florence, dated 1440, referring to the transfer of 2 decks to Sigismondo Pandolfo Malatesta. These new decks were called carte da trionfi, triumph cards. The term trionfi evoked the triumphal processions of ancient Rome, those grand parades in which victorious generals displayed their prisoners and spoils through the city streets. There was a suggestion of hierarchy and superiority in this nomenclature, as the triumphs had the power to beat any card of the common suits. But even before this Florentine record, there are indications that something similar was already being created at the court of Milan. A lost deck, commissioned by Duke Filippo Maria Visconti, was described by the secretary Martiano da Tortona, probably between 1418 and 1425. Martiano described a 60-card deck with 16 cards, featuring images of Roman gods and suits depicting 4 types of birds. These 16 cards were considered trumps, for in 1449, Jacopo Antonio Marcello, recalled that the then-deceased duke had invented what he called in Latin a new and exquisite type of triumphs. This deck, though lost to history, may have been the precursor to everything that would come later. The figure of Filippo Maria Visconti is central to this narrative. Duke of Milan since 1412, Visconti was a man of contradictions. Described as reclusive, suspicious, and physically unattractive, he rarely appeared in public and ruled mainly through his advisors and generals. However, he was also a lover of the arts and culture, a generous patron who attracted artists, writers, and musicians from all over Italy to his court. It was under his patronage that the painter Michelino da Besozzo, considered one of the greatest artists of his time, created the illustrations for that lost deck of 60 cards. What exactly motivated Visconti to commission such an elaborate deck remains a mystery. Perhaps it was simply the pleasure of the game, combined with the desire to possess something unique and exclusive, an object that reflected his position and refinement. Perhaps there was also an element of competition with other courts, a desire to demonstrate that Milan was capable of producing wonders that no other city could match. Whatever the motivation, the fact is that this deck established a precedent that would be followed and expanded upon in the following decades. The first properly documented tarot decks were recorded between 1440 and 1450 in the cities of Milan, Ferrara, Florence, and Bologna. These decks combined the traditional deck of 4 suits, each with 14 cards, totaling 56 cards, with an additional set of 21 trumps and a special card, the Fool, which functioned as a wild card. The total was 78 cards, the same amount that defines a complete tarot deck to this day. The trumps with their allegorical illustrations were the great innovation. Each card represented a figure or concept that was part of the collective imagination of the time. The magician, the popess, the empress, the emperor, the pope, the lovers, the chariot, justice, the hermit, the wheel of fortune, fortitude, the hanged man, death, temperance, the devil, the tower, the star, the moon, the sun, judgment, and the world. These figures were not random choices. They reflected the values, beliefs, and concerns of Italian Renaissance society, and many of them had roots in philosophical, religious, and artistic traditions dating back to antiquity. The idea of the trumps may have been inspired, at least in part, by the poem The Triumphs, Mai Trionfi, by the great Italian poet Francesco Petrarch, published in 1351. In this work, Petrarch describes a series of allegorical processions in which abstract concepts triumph over one another. Love triumphs over man, chastity triumphs over love, death triumphs over chastity, fame triumphs over death, time triumphs over fame, and finally, eternity triumphs over time. This hierarchy of triumphs finds evident parallels in the structure of the tarot trumps, where each card occupies a specific position on an ascending scale of power. Among the oldest tarot decks that have survived to our day, the most famous are the approximately 15 sets of the so-called Visconti Sforza tarot, painted in the mid-15th century for the rulers of the Duchy of Milan. These decks are true works of art, executed with mastery and a wealth of detail that remains impressive today. The cards were hand-painted on sturdy cardstock with opaque paints over backgrounds worked in gold, and they measure approximately 175 millimeters by 87 millimeters. Each card is a small Renaissance painting, with figures dressed in costumes of the time, surrounded by heraldic ornaments and symbols of the Visconti and Sforza families. The name Visconti Sforza refers to the 2 noble families who commissioned and owned these cards. The connection between them occurred through the marriage of Bianca Maria Visconti, the only daughter of Filippo Maria Visconti, to Francesco Sforza, a condottiero and mercenary captain of great military skill. This marriage, celebrated in 1441, united the 2 families and eventually led Francesco Sforza to the ducal throne of Milan after the death of his father-in-law in 1447. The most well-known Visconti Sforza decks are 3 distinct sets, today divided among various museums and private collections around the world. The oldest of them is the so-called Carry Yale, also known as the Visconti di Modrone, which is believed to have been produced between 1442 and 1447. This deck, now held by the Beinecker Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University in New Haven, is unique for several reasons. It originally contained a dame and a maid in each suit, in addition to the conventional king, queen, knight, and page, resulting in 6 court cards per suit instead of the usual 4. Furthermore, the deck included 3 trump cards representing the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, which do not appear in any other tarot deck of that era. The second set, and perhaps the most celebrated, is the so-called Pierpont Morgan Bergamo, produced around 1451. Originally composed of 78 cards, the deck today contains 74, as 4 were lost over the centuries: the Devil, the Tower, the Knight of Coins, and the 3 of Swords. The remaining 35 cards are divided between the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, the Accademia Carrara in Bergamo, and the private collection of the Colleoni family, also in Bergamo. The trumps and court cards feature elaborate gold backgrounds, while the numbered cards are cream-colored, decorated with flower and vine motifs. The third set is the so-called Brambilla, named after Giovanni Brambilla, who acquired the cards in Venice in 1900. Since 1971, this deck has been part of the collection of the Pinacoteca di Brera in Milan. It is believed to have been commissioned from Bonifacio Bembo by Francesco Sforza in 1463. Bonifacio Bembo, the artist to whom most of these decks are attributed, was a painter and illuminator from Cremona, active between approximately 1442 and 1477. Bembo was the favorite painter of Bianca Maria Visconti and her husband Francesco Sforza, and his workshop was responsible for producing paintings, frescoes, biblical scenes, and evidently tarot cards. More recent research suggests that some of the sets attributed to Bonifacio may actually be the work of his older brother Andrea Bembo or other artists in his circle such as Francesco Zavattari. However, the general style of the Visconti Sforza cards, with their elegant figures, gold backgrounds, and meticulous attention to detail, unequivocally reflects the artistic tradition of the Bembo workshop. The beauty of these cards was such that, according to scholars, they were rarely used for playing. Analysis of the wear on the surviving cards indicates that they were handled very little, suggesting they were treated more as art objects and symbols of prestige than as instruments of daily entertainment. This is not surprising considering the artistic and financial investment their production required. Each card was individually hand-painted, a process that demanded time, skill, and expensive materials. While the Visconti Sforza decks represent the pinnacle of artistic tarot production in the 15th century, other decks of the same era explored different paths. The Solabusca tarot, created in the late 1490s, is particularly notable. It is the oldest complete tarot deck to have survived intact, with all 78 cards preserved. Unlike the Visconti Sforza decks, the Solabusca was produced through copperplate engraving, a technique that allowed for greater precision in detail, and then hand-colored. What makes the Solabusca truly revolutionary is the fact that it is the first known tarot deck in which all the cards, including those of the common suits, are illustrated with figurative scenes. In previous decks, only the trumps and court cards received elaborate illustrations, while the numbered cards simply featured the corresponding number of suit symbols. In the Solabusca, each card tells a visual story with characters involved in various activities, an innovation that would not become standard until more than 400 years later, when Pamela Colman Smith created the illustrations for the Rider-Waite-Smith deck in 1909. The trumps of the Solabusca also distinguished themselves by not following traditional tarot iconography. Instead of the usual allegorical figures, they depicted heroes and historical characters from classical antiquity, such as Nebuchadnezzar, Gaius Marius, and other protagonists of Roman history. The trumps featured numbering in Roman numerals, while the suit cards used Arabic numerals, a combination that reflected the meeting of distinct cultural traditions. The Latin motto that appeared on some cards, Traho Fatis, which means I am led by fate, gave the deck an aura of mystery and philosophical depth. The Solabusca remained virtually unknown for centuries, passing from hand to hand among noble Italian families without ever reaching public visibility. In 1907, the Busca Serbelloni family, who then owned the deck, donated black and white photographs of all 78 cards to the British Museum in London. It was there that, 2 years later, the images were likely seen by Arthur Edward Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith, who were working on the creation of their own tarot deck. The similarities between several cards of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck and the Sola Busca are evident, especially in the 3 of Swords and the 10 of Wands, confirming the influence of the Renaissance deck on the most famous modern creation of tarot. In 2009, the Italian Ministry of Cultural Heritage and Activities acquired the Sola Busca deck for €800,000, delivering it to the Pinacoteca di Brera in Milan, where it can be appreciated by the public to this day. In 15th century Italy, although the set of cards included in tarot decks was generally consistent, the nomenclature and ordering of the trumps varied considerably from region to region. These regional variations constitute a fascinating field of study, as they reveal the different cultural traditions and aesthetic preferences of the various Italian city-states. The historian Michael Dummett, one of the greatest scholars of tarot, classified the variations of trump ordering into 3 main categories. In Bologna and Florence, the highest trump was the angel, followed by the world. This group spread mainly to the south, crossing the Papal States, the Kingdom of Naples, and finally reaching the Kingdom of Sicily, although it was also known in the states of Savoy. In Ferrara, the world was the highest trump, followed by justice and the angel. This group spread mainly to the northeast, as far as Venice and Trento, where it was only a passing fad, dying out by the end of the 16th century. In Milan, the world was the highest trump, followed by the angel, and this ordering is the one used in the Tarot of Marseille. Dummett also wrote about a possible 4th lineage that may have existed along the Franco-Italian border, spreading north through France until its last descendant, the Belgian tarot, died out around 1800. These regional variations were not mere whims. They reflected deep differences in how different communities understood the hierarchy of values represented in the trumps. The relative position of the angel and the world, for example, could indicate whether a certain community valued spiritual transcendence or earthly fulfillment more. These were philosophical questions translated into the seemingly simple language of a card game. Although a Dominican preacher railed against the inherent evils of playing cards, mainly because of their use in gambling, in a sermon in the 15th century, no routine condemnations of tarot were found during its early history. This absence of religious opposition is notable, considering that the Catholic Church was a powerful and vigilant institution that did not hesitate to condemn practices it considered morally dangerous. The fact that tarot escaped this condemnation suggests that, in its early days, it was seen simply as a game, without the esoteric and divinatory connotations that would be associated with it centuries later. The production of the first tarot decks was a craft undertaking of great complexity. Since the oldest cards were hand-painted, one by one, it is believed that the number of decks produced was relatively small. Each deck was a unique work of art, created on commission for a specific patron, usually a member of the high nobility. This meant that tarot was, in its early years, an exclusive pastime of the elites, inaccessible to the vast majority of the population. This situation began to change with the invention of the printing press. The possibility of reproducing cards on a large scale, using woodcuts and later metal engravings, democratized access to tarot and allowed its dissemination to a much larger portion of society. The cards ceased to be luxury objects reserved for palaces and began to circulate in taverns, fairs, and gambling houses throughout Europe. The expansion of tarot beyond Italian borders occurred mainly during the Italian Wars, a series of conflicts involving the great European powers in the dispute for control of the Italian peninsula between 1494 and 1559. When the French and Swiss armies marched over northern Italy, they found there, among many other things, tarot decks, and when they returned to their countries of origin, they took with them not only the spoils of war, but also this fascinating card game. The most prominent version of tarot that spread through France and Switzerland was the so-called Tarot of Marseille, of Milanese origin. The name might suggest that the deck was created in Marseille, but in fact it was initially developed in the Milan region and later adapted and produced on a large scale in the French port city. The Tarot of Marseille was not invented in Marseille. It was Marseille that gave it a second wind and a unique visual identity. The oldest deck of the Marseille pattern that has survived to our day is that of Philippe Vachier, dated 1639. Vachier was a card maker who worked in Marseille from 1632 until around 1670. His deck, composed of 78 cards produced by woodcut with colors applied by stencil, remained unknown for centuries until it was discovered by the French historian Thierry Despolices. In 2023, the deck was auctioned in Paris, causing great excitement in the world of tarot collectors and scholars. Fortunately, it was acquired by Yves Reynaud, a Marseille card maker dedicated to preserving the tarot tradition, who published a faithful reproduction of the deck, making it accessible to the public for the first time in nearly 400 years. The Tarot of Marseille became the predominant model for tarot decks in France and much of Western Europe. Its visual characteristics, with expressive figures, vibrant primary colors, bold lines, and an iconography both simple and deeply symbolic, became instantly recognizable and influenced practically all subsequent tarot decks. By the end of the 17th century, Marseille had become the largest producer of tarot cards in the world. The Panier district, in the heart of the city, housed numerous master card makers, each employing dozens of workers. By the end of that century, there were at least 9 active card-making workshops in the city, and a street still preserves the memory of this tradition today, the Traverse des Quartiers, Cardmakers' Crossing. These artisans did not limit themselves to reproducing existing models. They also created, illustrated and printed cards using very specific techniques, notably wood engraving and hand coloring. While the Tarot of Marseille consolidated itself as the dominant standard in France and much of Europe, other regional variations continued to flourish in Italy. In Florence, an expanded deck called Minciate gained popularity starting in the early 16th century. The first known mention of this game under the name Germany dates back to 1506, and the name derived from the Gemini card, the highest trump among the recently introduced cards. The Minciate deck was notable for its size and complexity. With 97 cards, it included not only the traditional tarot trumps, but also astrological symbols corresponding to the 12 signs of the zodiac and the 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. These additions transformed the game into something considerably more complex than conventional tarot, requiring players to have greater strategic capacity and a broader knowledge of the symbology used. The Knights of the Minciate, who in Marseille-type decks were represented as figures mounted on horses, appeared in many Minciate decks as centaurs or sphinxes, mythological creatures that gave the game an atmosphere of mystery and fantasy. The suits followed the Portuguese pattern, with the exception of the clubs, which were represented as staves, following the northern Italian suit system. From Florence, Minciate spread to other regions of Italy and even to France during the 17th century. Until the end of the 18th century, tarot was essentially a card game used for entertainment and gambling, without any mystical or divinatory connotation. The transformation of tarot into an instrument of divination and esoteric exploration is a later chapter of this story, and one that deserves to be told carefully, as it involved a series of misconceptions, creative interpretations, and invented mythologies that intertwined with the real history of the cards in surprising ways. The starting point of this transformation can be located in 1781, when the French scholar Antoine Coeur de Gébelin published the 8th volume of his monumental work Le Monde Primitif, The Primitive World. In this volume, Coeur de Gébelin presented an audacious and, as would later be proven, completely unfounded theory. He claimed that tarot cards were actually remnants of an ancient book of Egyptian wisdom, the legendary Book of Thoth, the Egyptian god of knowledge. According to Coeur de Gébelin, tarot had been brought from Egypt to Europe by the gypsies, who had used it as an instrument of divination since time immemorial. This theory had no historical basis. Coeur de Gébelin lived in an era of great fascination with the culture of ancient Egypt, and his claims reflected the prejudices and fantasies of his era more than any serious research. However, His ideas found fertile ground in the popular imagination and among the esoteric circles of the time, and they had profound and lasting consequences. Inspired by Cours de Gébelin's ideas, Jean-Baptiste Alliette, a French arithmetic teacher, who adopted the pseudonym Étalia, an inversion of his surname, published a manual in 1785 titled Manière de se récréer avec le jeu de cartes nommé tarot, how to entertain oneself with the game of cards called tarots. Étalia is generally credited as the creator of the term cartomancy to describe the use of cards for divinatory purposes, and in 1789 he published the first deck specifically designed for esoteric use, the so-called Grand Étalia. This deck included references to astrology, alchemy, and occult knowledge, inaugurating a new phase in the history of tarot. The most famous fortune teller of all time, Marie-Anne Adélaïde Lenormand, is said to have used Étalia's deck upon arriving in Paris in 1789, the same year as the French Revolution. Lenormand created a clairvoyance salon that attracted the most illustrious names of the time, consolidating the image of tarot as an instrument for predicting the future in French popular culture. In the 19th century, the French occultist Eliphas Lévy deepened the connection between tarot and the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, associating each of the 22 trumps for the first time with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. This association, though equally devoid of historical basis, became a fundamental pillar of modern esotericism and deeply influenced the interpretation of tarot in subsequent generations. In late 19th century England, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a secret society dedicated to the study and practice of ceremonial magic, incorporated tarot into its system of teaching and initiation. Prominent members of the order, such as Arthur Edward Waite and Aleister Crowley, would develop their own tarot decks, which would become the most influential of the 20th century. In 1909, Arthur Edward Waite commissioned the British artist Pamela Colman Smith to create the illustrations for a new tarot deck. Smith and Waite had met in the Order of the Golden Dawn and shared a deep interest in spiritualism, ritualism, and symbolism. During the summer of that year, Smith produced the illustrations for all 78 cards, creating what would become the most popular and widely used tarot deck in the world. The Rider-Waite-Smith deck, so called in reference to the publisher Rider and Company, the conceptualizer Arthur Edward Waite, and the artist Pamela Colman Smith, introduced significant innovations to the tarot tradition. The most important of these was the complete illustration of all the minor arcana suit cards, something that had not been done since the Sola Busca Tarot more than 400 years earlier. Smith visited an exhibition of 15th century Italian tarot cards at the British Museum in 1907, which is said to have deeply inspired her work. Despite her invaluable contribution to the history of tarot, Pamela Colman Smith received little recognition in her lifetime. Waite paid her a modest sum for the creation of the illustrations, and she received no royalties from the sale of the decks. Smith passed away in 1951 in relative obscurity, and it was only in the following decades that her fundamental role in creating the world's most famous deck began to be properly recognized. The Smith and Waite deck became immensely popular during the 1970s, when a renewed interest in tarot and esotericism spread through Western culture. The deck was especially adopted by feminist movements, anti-war activists, and human rights defenders, who found in the images of the cards a symbolic language to express their aspirations and values. Since then, the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot has been continuously reprinted and serves as a model for countless contemporary decks. But it would be a mistake to think that the history of tarot is summed up by its esoteric and divinatory dimension. In continental Europe, especially in France, Switzerland, Austria, and parts of Italy, tarot continued to be played as a card game throughout all these centuries, without any mystical connotation. Italian tarocchini, French tarot, and Austrian tarot are variations of a trick-taking game that uses the complete tarot deck and is played to this day, keeping alive the original ludic tradition that gave rise to these cards. In France, the French Tarot Federation publishes the official rules of the game and organizes regular competitions, demonstrating that tarot as a card game is far from a relic of the past. In many regions of Europe, sitting around a table to play a game of tarot remains a popular and respected pastime, as far removed from cartomancy as chess is from astrology. It is this duality that makes the history of tarot so fascinating. On one hand, we have a card game invented in northern Italy in the 15th century, an aristocratic amusement that was democratized with the invention of the printing press and spread throughout Europe. On the other, we have an instrument of divination and self-knowledge that emerged at the end of the 18th century, the fruit of mistaken but creative interpretations that took deep root in Western culture. And between these two poles, we have centuries of art, history, and cultural transformation. Tarot cards are, in a sense, a mirror of humanity. They reflect our fears and hopes, our values and contradictions, our incessant search for meaning in a world that so often seems chaotic and incomprehensible. From the Mamluk artisan who painted the first playing cards in a Cairo workshop to the British artist who illustrated the world's most famous deck in a London studio, passing through the Italian nobles who transformed simple cards into Renaissance works of art, each chapter of this story is a testament to the creativity and adaptability of the human spirit. The cards traveled from continent to continent, transforming at every stop, absorbing elements from each culture that welcomed them, and yet maintaining something essential, something that remains recognizable through the centuries. The four suits that the Mamluk artisan painted in the 13th century, coins, swords, cups, and staves, are the same four suits we find in a tarot deck bought today in any bookstore in the world. This continuity is remarkable and reminds us that, however much civilizations change, certain fundamental structures of human experience remain surprisingly constant. The 78 cards of the tarot continue to tell their silent stories. The Fool begins his journey, walking carefree at the edge of a precipice. The Magician raises his wand toward the sky. The Empress rests on her throne, surrounded by abundance. The Wheel of Fortune turns incessantly, raising some and casting down others. Death rides its white steed, reminding us that all cycles come to an end, and that from every end, a new beginning is born. And the world dances in its laurel wreath, celebrating completeness and fulfillment. These images, born in the workshops of Italian Renaissance artisans, refined by the card makers of Marseille, reinterpreted by French and English occultists, and continuously reinvented by contemporary artists around the world, constitute one of the richest and most enduring symbolic languages of Western culture. They have survived wars, revolutions, regime changes, and technological transformations. They have crossed geographical, linguistic, and cultural borders, and they continue to fascinate, intrigue, and inspire more than 500 years after their emergence. The history of tarot is ultimately a story about the human condition itself. It is about our need to play and amuse ourselves, our fascination with the beautiful and the mysterious, our tendency to seek patterns and meanings, even where they perhaps do not exist, our capacity to transform everyday objects into vehicles of artistic and philosophical expression, and above all, our tireless curiosity about what the future holds, a curiosity as old as civilization itself, and which, like tarot cards, seems destined to endure as long as there are human beings on the face of the earth. From a workshop in 13th century Cairo to a studio in London at the beginning of the 20th century, from the hands of the Duke of Milan to the hands of anyone who today shuffles a pack of 78 cards, the tarot has traveled an extraordinary journey. And this journey, like the best stories, is far from over. With every new deck that is created, with every new interpretation that is offered, with every new hand that reaches out to turn a card, the tarot reinvents and renews itself, proving that some stories are truly eternal. If this journey through time and the mysteries of tarot cards has piqued your curiosity, if you felt the fascination of exploring the paths traveled by these small pieces of illustrated paper over centuries, then do as the great patrons of the Italian Renaissance did. Invest in that which awakens your passion. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next documentary narratives, leave your like as a sign that this story resonated with you, and share in the comments which aspect of this millenary saga most caught your attention. After all, just like the tarot, every comment tells a story and every story deserves to be heard. We'll see you in the next documentary.